Moving on to the next section, we're going to start adding some shading into the scene now that we've got all of our highlights. So once again, I'm going to start at the back of the scene and work my way towards the camera. And I'm going to be picking out shadows on all the main items in the scene. So I'm going to be looking at starting off with the hills, the tree and the fence on the hills. I'm not going to add any additional shading onto the clouds. It's a nice, bright, sunny scene, so you're not really going to get really harsh background or really harsh black shadows or dark shadows on those clouds. So let's take a look at the hill first. What I want to do is cast some shadows off this tree. And what I need to do is sort of work out the angle that the sun's coming from, and that's sort of coming from a slight upper left angle on this tree. So I'm going to make sure my shadow is slightly towards the right, sort of angled a little bit towards the right. So basically what I'm doing is drawing essentially like a reflected version of the tree, and I'm using the marquee selection to select part of the tree, move the pivot point of that transformation box, and then I can kind of squash sections of the tree to get the right proportions. It doesn't have to be super accurate because we're doing a stylized drawing. So once I've got it roughly in shape, then I can adjust the transparency and the blending modes, and I can also do a perspective transformation on this as well, which I might have a go at. And I can use the perspective mode on that transformation, that free transform. So that's what I'm doing here. So I'm right clicking and selecting perspective mode, and then I can widen the bottom end of the shadow to make it look as though it's the shadow's getting bigger as it's the closer sections are bigger. So the next thing I want to do is refine some shadows on the rocks, and once again I'm sort of playing around with a hue saturation modification here to make the rocks a little more saturated. I'm using the magnetic lasso tool as well to select an area that I can then mask out the hue saturation. So this hue saturation was added in the previous videos to add this red tone to the rocks. And what I'm doing is selecting the back end of the rocks where they would be shadowed the most, and I'm desaturating them sort of back to their original kind of browny grey colour by painting black into the mask on this hue saturation layer. And so that kind of gives you the effect of the back end, the shadowed end, being a little bit more sort of darker and desaturated, even though the tone is actually getting lighter. So now what I can do is go in and make these selections and just darken these sections a little bit more, and sort of give them a proper shade layer in order to give more of a shadow. Now, I was going to use the lasso tool there to create an area, a selection, and then fill that with a black color for the shadow for the leaf. I'm using a Wacom tablet, a Cintiq, and sometimes the styluses, when you're doing very fine selection work with a lasso, oftentimes if the nib of the pen even slightly brushes the surface of the tablet, it acts like a double click, which actually closes the selection when you're using these lasso tools. So they can be very fiddly to use with a tablet. So what I've done while I'm using the lasso tool for making these little selections for these shadows is switch to a mouse. So that way you've got absolutely no way of accidentally clicking while you're making your selections. So once again, what I'm doing is filling a layer with a black color. So make a selection, fill it with black, and then adjust it basically by using, what I'm doing is using a overlay blending mode. What that does is it darkens the color underneath, but it also doesn't desaturate the color, which the multiply or screen options, depending on if you're going, dark or light. It doesn't desaturate them the same way. So what that allows you to do is kind of keep the color. So you can see that on the rocks, in sort of in the distance near the fence, the shadow of those rocks is actually remaining like a dark red rather than going completely black. And you'll see that on the various fence post shadows and so on. What I also end up doing is adding an additional shadow layer. So I duplicate those shadow layers and then switch the blending mode on the duplicate back to just normal blending mode. So the shadows go completely black. And then what I do is dial the opacity down for that to adjust the overall darkness of the shadows. So the overlay shadow layer is giving me a bit of shadowed color, and then the normal layer, you can see that happening there. The normal blending mode layer basically is just an opacity adjustment just to darken or lighten the shadow up until I'm happy with what it looks like. And essentially I sort of do that across most of the shadows in the scene. So now I'm adding in shadow for this tree. Once again, you can see there the overlay and opacity adjustments there. And at the moment I'm playing around with the idea of, because obviously the back of the tree that's facing us would all be in shadow because the light is coming from the other side. So what I'm doing is filling in some areas to basically make it look as though the back of the branch and the back of the trunk is actually in shadow, and then the branch is casting a shadow around the side of the trunk. Moving on to the leaves on this bush, this is where I want to play around with some translucency. So I want the shadows from the leaves in front and from these stalks. What I'm doing here is drawing in shadows that are casting from the sun onto the stalk, onto the leaf. And we're seeing through the back of the leaf, we're seeing those shadows a little bit. So it's sort of just a bit of a technical effect that I'm trying to, sort of simulate there. And it's not accurate. It's not really real world accurate, but it's sort of just giving us the illusion that there's something a little bit more going on than just drawing plain old shadows. Just adding a bit of definition to these stalks. And then I'm going through and adding little shadows onto the little veins and ribs, kind of stem rib things on the leaves, just to bring that detail out. They get a little bit lost in the shadows there. Adding a bit of shadowing for the leaf as well. And so now I'm doing the final placement for the character. So we've got lots of shadows to think about here. We've got the shadow that the character casts onto the ground, but then we also have the shadow that the character is essentially casting on itself. So the shadowed side of the body. So I've got currently I've got two shadows that I'm drawing on the one layer here. Now it's going to be difficult. The problem with having the ground shadow and the body shadow all in the same layer is that I can't use a clipping mask or a clipping layer for it, because what that'll do is kill the ground shadow. The ground shadow will vanish because it's not overlapping on the character layer. So eventually what I end up doing is splitting the ground shadow off onto its own layer. And then what I can do is use a clipping mask. So at the moment what I'm doing is a marquee selection on the character layer, and then I invert that selection so that in essence it's selecting all the rest of the picture except the character. And then with the shadow layer selected, I can just delete, and it will basically trim off all of the excess shadow from around the character, so it's nice and neat. And then I just go in and tweak the highlights a bit.